Modernism believed that truth was discoverable through reason, science, and grand unifying narratives. It promised progress, certainty, and the perfectibility of humanity through knowledge and rational systems. Postmodernism dismantled these claims by exposing their hidden assumptions, power structures, and contradictions. It revealed that so-called universal truths were often masks for particular interests and perspectives. Postmodernism showed us that language does not simply mirror reality, but actively constructs what we perceive. This insight was liberating, but it came with a devastating side effect that hollowed out meaning. By the late 20th century, irony had become the dominant cultural posture in Western societies. Irony allowed people to simultaneously participate in culture while distancing themselves from genuine commitment. You could wear a band shirt while mocking people who care about music that passionately. You could engage in politics while signalling that you were too sophisticated to truly believe in anything. This protective cynicism became a prison disguised as freedom for an entire generation. Everything could be deconstructed, but nothing could be built without being immediately undermined by knowing smirks. The cultural theorists who developed metamodernism observed something shifting in the early 2000s. Artists, writers, and filmmakers began experimenting with sincerity while retaining their postmodern self-awareness. They did not abandon irony entirely, nor did they naively return to pre-postmodern certainties. Instead, they began oscillating between positions, holding contradictions in productive tension without resolving them. This was not simply a synthesis of modernism and postmodernism in some neat dialectical package. It was an attempt to move forward without pretending the postmodern critique never happened. Metamodernism emerged as a name for this cultural shift and the philosophical questions it raises. The term itself has multiple distinct meanings depending on who uses it and in what context. Some treat it as a cultural period following postmodernism in chronological terms. Others treat it as a structure of feeling that describes a particular sensibility in contemporary life. Still others treat it as a normative philosophical project with prescriptions for how we should think. Understanding these distinctions matters because much confusion arises from conflating these different usages. Part 1. The Origin and Core Mechanism. The formal articulation of metamodernism began with two Dutch cultural theorists in 2010. Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker published an essay called Notes on Metamodernism. They were observing contemporary art, architecture and film that no longer fit postmodern categories comfortably. Something had changed in how artists related to sincerity, hope, and the possibility of meaning. The postmodern years of pastiche and parataxis seemed to be ending without returning to modernist naivety. A new sensibility was emerging that required a new conceptual vocabulary to describe and analyze. The central mechanism they identified was oscillation between seemingly incompatible positions and attitudes. This is not synthesis, where opposites merge into something that transcends both original positions. It is not balance, where you find a stable middle point between two extremes. It is perpetual movement between poles, like a pendulum that never comes to rest at centre. One moment you inhabit modernist hope, and the next moment you acknowledge postmodern scepticism. Both positions remain active and unresolved, generating productive tension rather than comfortable resolution. The term meta in metamodernism does not primarily mean self-referential, as in common usage. Vermeulen and van den Akker derived it from Plato's concept of metaxy, which means between. In Plato's Symposium, the philosopher exists in metaxy, the space between ignorance and wisdom. The lover of wisdom is neither fully ignorant nor fully wise, but suspended in the pursuit. This in-between state is not a deficiency to overcome, but the authentic condition of human existence. We are always between mortality and immortality, between the finite and the infinite, never fully either. Plato used metaxy to describe eros as a mediating spirit between humans and the divine. Eros was neither God nor human, but a force moving between these poles and connecting them. This mediating function creates relationship and communication between otherwise separated realms of being. The metamodern borrows this structure to describe oscillation between modern and postmodern positions. You move between enthusiasm and irony, between hope and melancholy, between naivety and knowingness. The movement itself becomes the defining characteristic rather than any fixed position you might occupy. Vermeulen and van den Akker called this a structure of feeling, borrowing from cultural theorist Raymond Williams. A structure of feeling captures the lived texture of experience in a particular historical moment. It is not ideology or worldview, but something more atmospheric and pre-rational in character. You sense it before you can articulate it in the shared moods and orientations of a generation. The meta-modern structure of feeling emerged from specific historical conditions in the early 21st century. Climate change, the 2008 financial crisis, and digital revolution created its context. The 2008 financial crisis shattered confidence in the neoliberal economic consensus that postmodernism accompanied. The climate crisis made the stakes of collective action feel genuinely existential and urgent. Digital technology promised connection while simultaneously fragmenting attention and enabling surveillance capitalism. These were not problems that ironic detachment or deconstructive critique could adequately address. Something more active, constructive and committed seemed necessary without abandoning critical consciousness. The metamodern sensibility emerged partly as a response to this felt inadequacy of available cultural tools. Vermeulen and van den Akker described the metamodern attitude as informed naivety and pragmatic idealism. These paradoxical phrases capture the attempt to hold contradictory positions simultaneously without collapse. Informed naivety means believing in things while knowing the postmodern critiques of such belief. You act as if your commitments matter while acknowledging that ultimate foundations remain unavailable. Pragmatic idealism means pursuing ideals without expecting their full realization in any final sense. The impossibility of reaching the horizon does not make the journey toward it meaningless. This connects to Immanuel Kant's philosophy of as if, which Vermeulen and van den Akker explicitly invoke. Kant argued we must act as if certain things were true, even without proving them. We must treat humanity as progressing towards some goal, even if that goal remains forever unreachable. This is not self-deception, because you remain fully aware of the as-if character of your commitment. You consciously commit to an impossible possibility because the commitment itself generates meaning and direction. The metamodern inherits this structure, but applies it to cultural and artistic production specifically. The alternative to oscillation would be either naively returning to modernism or remaining stuck in postmodern paralysis. Naive return ignores everything we learned about power, perspective, and the limits of grand narratives. Postmodern paralysis leaves us without resources for building, committing, or moving toward better futures. Oscillation allows movement without pretending we have resolved problems that remain genuinely unresolved. You can be sincere about your commitments while ironically aware of your own potential for self-deception. You can deconstruct while also constructing, holding both activities in dynamic, productive tension. David Foster Wallace anticipated much of this sensibility in his 1993 essay on television and fiction. He argued that irony had become the dominant mode of American culture through television's influence. Irony was originally a tool for exposing hypocrisy and challenging authority structures in meaningful ways. But when irony becomes the default position, it loses its critical power entirely. You cannot rebel through irony when the mainstream culture itself operates through irony continuously. Wallace called for what he termed anti-rebels willing to risk accusations of sentimentality and naivety. Wallace predicted the next real literary rebels would endorse single entendre values without protective ironic distance. They would risk the rolled eyes and cool smiles of sophisticated audiences who fear sincere engagement. This was not a call to abandon irony, but to reclaim the capacity for earnest commitment. Wallace himself wrote with enormous self-awareness while pursuing genuine, emotional, and ethical engagement. His work demonstrated that you could be simultaneously knowing and sincere without contradiction. This stance would later be called post-irony and become central to metamodern cultural production. Post-irony does not mean after irony in the sense of leaving irony behind completely. It means a relationship to irony that incorporates it while not being limited by it. You can deploy irony strategically without irony becoming your fundamental orientation toward everything. Sincerity and irony become tools rather than fixed identities that determine all your responses. The metamodern artist or thinker moves between these modes depending on what the situation demands. This flexibility distinguishes metamodernism from both naive sincerity and the totalizing irony of postmodernism. Luke Turner published the Metamodernist Manifesto in 2011, attempting to codify this sensibility. The manifesto called for oscillation as the natural order of the world, driving forward momentum. It proposed liberation from both modernist ideological naivety and postmodern cynical insincerity equally. Metamodernism would be the mercurial condition between and beyond irony and sincerity permanently. Turner's manifesto was itself performed in metamodern fashion, earnest and slightly preposterous simultaneously. It embodied the oscillation it described, being serious about ideas while aware of manifestos as genre. Part 2. The three major schools of metamodernism. Metamodernism is not a unified doctrine with a single authoritative definition accepted by all practitioners. Three distinct schools have emerged, each emphasizing different aspects and applications of metamodern thought. Understanding their differences prevents confusion when encountering metamodern ideas in different contexts. These schools share family resemblances but diverge significantly in methods, goals, and underlying assumptions. The cultural aesthetic school focuses on describing contemporary art and shifts in sensibility. The philosophical methodology school attempts to transform how academic research in humanities operates. The developmental politics school uses metamodernism to prescribe social and political transformation. Each school has produced substantial bodies of work that reward careful independent examination. Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker founded the Cultural Aesthetics School through their 2010 essay. They positioned metamodernism as primarily descriptive rather than prescriptive in its analytical function. Their goal was to name and analyze an emerging structure of feeling already visible in cultural production. They did not intend to create a movement or tell artists how they should create work. Metamodernism, in their framing, is a rubric for interpretation, not a manifesto for action. This descriptive stance distinguishes their approach from more normatively ambitious versions that followed later. Vermeulen and van den Akker draw heavily on cultural theory traditions, particularly Frederick Jameson and Raymond Williams. Jameson famously described postmodernism as the cultural logic of late capitalism in his influential work. Williams developed the concept of structures of feeling to capture emergent cultural sensibilities before articulation. By positioning metamodernism as another cultural logic, they place it in conversation with Marxist cultural analysis. The economic base still matters in their account, shaping the superstructure of cultural production. Climate crisis, financial collapse, and digital technology form the material conditions generating metamodern responses. Their primary evidence comes from close analysis of contemporary artistic and architectural works. They examine Herzog and de Meuron's buildings, Bastian Ader's performances, and films by Spike Jonze. These works exhibit the oscillation between modernist sincerity and postmodern irony they theorize. The analysis is empirical in the sense of observing cultural phenomena and attempting systematic description. They avoid strong metaphysical claims about the nature of reality or prescriptions for how society should organize. This modesty is both a strength limiting overreach and a weakness limiting transformative potential. Jason Josephson Storm represents the Philosophical Methodology School through his 2021 book. Storm is a professor of religion and science studies at Williams College with training in philosophy. His metamodernism is explicitly a research program for the humanities and social sciences specifically. He aims to move beyond the impasses of postmodern critique that have paralyzed academic knowledge production. Where Vermeulen and van den Akker describe culture, Storm prescribes how scholars should conduct inquiry. His project is more ambitious philosophically and more technical in its argumentation and apparatus. Storm identifies 5 core problems that postmodernism created for scholarly research in human sciences. These include anti-realism, skepticism about objectivity, ethical nihilism, and the extreme linguistic turn. Postmodern critique revealed that categories like religion, science, and art lack stable universal definitions. This revelation was important, but left scholars unable to make positive claims without immediate deconstruction. Every assertion could be undermined by showing its contingency, partiality, or embeddedness in power structures. The result was a kind of scholarly paralysis, where critique became the only legitimate intellectual activity. Storm proposes what he calls process social ontology as a foundation for metamodern research. Social categories are real, but not in the way modernism assumed, with fixed essences and clear boundaries. They exist as temporally stabilized patterns, what Storm calls social kinds, that emerge from ongoing processes. A social kind is held together by homeostatic property clusters rather than necessary and sufficient conditions. Religion, for example, has no essence but exhibits family resemblances maintained by various reinforcing mechanisms. This allows scholars to study categories as real phenomena without claiming they have eternal, unchanging natures. Storm also develops a theory of language he calls hylosemiotics that extends beyond human communication. Traditional philosophy of language focuses almost exclusively on how humans produce and interpret signs. Hylosemiotics situates human language on a continuum with animal and even plant signaling systems. This move naturalizes meaning-making without reducing it to mere mechanical information processing. Language remains meaningful and powerful while being understood as emerging from biological and material processes. This framework avoids both naive realism about language mirroring reality and extreme constructivism denying reference. Storm's epistemology emphasizes what he calls zetetic knowledge, from the Greek word for seeking or inquiring. Zetetic inquiry acknowledges fallibility while maintaining that genuine knowledge production remains possible and valuable. We can make claims that are better or worse, more or less warranted, without claiming certainty. This is humble knowledge that recognizes its own limitations while still asserting something substantive. Storm connects this to what he calls revolutionary happiness as the ethical aim of scholarly work. Research should contribute to human flourishing, not merely produce critique for its own sake. Hansi Freinacht represents the developmental politics school through books like The Listening Society. Freinacht is actually a pen name used by two Scandinavian authors, Daniel Goertz and Emil Einar Friis. Their work applies metamodernism to political philosophy, developmental psychology, and social transformation. Where Storm addresses academics, Freinacht addresses activists, policymakers, and citizens seeking change. Their metamodernism is explicitly normative, arguing for specific political and social arrangements. They believe metamodern principles can guide the next stage of civilizational development beyond liberal democracy. Freinacht distinguishes three meanings of metamodernism that operate at different levels of analysis. First, it names a cultural phase following postmodernism in historical periodization terms. Second, it names a developmental stage that builds upon and transcends previous stages of consciousness. Third, it names a political ideology or philosophical stance with prescriptive content for action. These three meanings interconnect but are not identical, operating at different scales of generality. The developmental stage meaning is particularly important because it introduces hierarchy and directionality. The developmental dimension draws heavily on neo-Piagetian psychology and adult development theory. Researchers like Robert Keegan and Michael Commons have mapped stages of increasing cognitive complexity. Individuals can operate at different levels depending on the complexity of tasks they can handle. Similarly, cultures and societies can be characterized by the dominant level of complexity they support. Metamodernism in this framing is not just different from modernism, but in some sense beyond it. This introduces normative hierarchy that the cultural aesthetic school deliberately avoids claiming. Freinacht's political vision centers on what he calls the listening society as the next evolutionary step. Modern welfare states address material needs through healthcare, education, and economic security provisions. The listening society would additionally address psychological and developmental needs of all citizens. It would create conditions for people to grow into higher stages of psychological development. This requires new institutions, new forms of education, and new approaches to mental health. The vision is utopian in aspiration while attempting to remain pragmatic about implementation pathways. The three schools relate to each other in complex ways, involving both overlap and tension. All three accept that postmodernism identified genuine problems with modernist assumptions about knowledge and progress. All three seek to move beyond postmodern paralysis without naively returning to pre-postmodern positions. All three employ the concept of oscillation or dynamic movement between seemingly opposed positions. But they differ significantly in their ambitions, methods, evidence bases, and prescriptive commitments. Understanding which school an author belongs to prevents misattributing claims across different frameworks. Critics argue that lumping these diverse projects under one term creates more confusion than clarity. Perhaps cultural description, academic methodology, and political ideology should have different names entirely. The shared terminology may suggest more unity than actually exists among these different intellectual projects. Defenders respond that the family resemblances are real and generative for cross-fertilization between approaches. The term provides a meeting point for scholars and practitioners working on related problems from different angles. Whether this terminological unity helps or hinders understanding remains an open and contested question. Part 3. Epistemology. How Metamodernism Treats Truth. The question of truth has haunted Western philosophy since its ancient Greek origins. Modernism generally assumed truth was discoverable through proper method, whether empirical or rational in nature. Postmodernism attacked this assumption by revealing how power, perspective, and language shape what counts as true. If all knowledge is situated and partial, the very concept of truth seems to dissolve. Metamodernism attempts to rehabilitate truth without ignoring the valid insights of postmodern critique. This rehabilitation requires careful navigation between naive realism and corrosive relativism equally. The postmodern critique of truth operated on multiple levels that must be distinguished clearly. At one level, postmodernists showed that claims to universal truth often masked particular interests and perspectives. What presented itself as objective knowledge was frequently the viewpoint of dominant groups, naturalized. At another level, postmodernists argued that language does not simply mirror a pre-existing reality. Our concepts actively shape what we can perceive and think, not merely label what exists independently. These insights remain valuable, and metamodernism does not simply reject them to return to innocence. However, postmodern critique often slid from valid insights into more extreme positions that created problems. If all perspectives are equally constructed, how can we distinguish better from worse knowledge claims? If language never refers to anything outside itself, how does science produce reliable technologies that work? If power is all that determines what counts as true, why bother with evidence and argument at all? These extreme conclusions made scholarly research seem pointless beyond revealing more power structures. The humanities and social sciences suffered a crisis of confidence about their own legitimacy and value. Metamodernism responds with what might be called a reconstructive epistemology that acknowledges situatedness while affirming reference. Knowledge is always produced from particular perspectives, but some perspectives illuminate reality better than others. Our concepts shape what we perceive, but the world pushes back against concepts that badly misrepresent it. Language refers imperfectly and provisionally, but it does refer to something beyond mere linguistic play. This position is sometimes called meta-realism, because it combines constructivist and realist insights carefully. It avoids both the view from nowhere of naive realism and the view from everywhere of extreme relativism. Jason Josephson Storm develops this epistemology through what he calls zetetic inquiry as a method. Zetetic comes from the Greek word for seeking, emphasizing that inquiry is an ongoing process. We never arrive at final truth, but can make genuine progress in understanding through careful investigation. Progress does not require certainty, only that some claims are better warranted than others. The warranted claims may be revised later as new evidence and arguments emerge over time. This fallibilism is not skepticism, because it affirms that current best understandings have genuine epistemic value. Storm distinguishes his position from both foundationalism and coherentism in traditional epistemology. Foundationalists seek secure foundations from which all knowledge can be derived with certainty. Coherentists hold that beliefs are justified by their coherence with other beliefs in a web. Both views have serious problems that philosophers have debated for centuries without resolution. Storm advocates a more pragmatic approach focused on what makes inquiry successful at producing useful knowledge. Success is measured by predictive power, explanatory scope, fruitfulness for further research, and practical application. The relationship between knowledge and values becomes crucial in meta-modern epistemology. Postmodernism revealed that the supposed value neutrality of science was itself a value-laden commitment. The choice of what to study, what methods to use, and how to interpret results involves normative judgments. This insight can lead to despair if we conclude that values contaminate all knowledge irredeemably. Metamodernism instead argues for transparency about values while maintaining that inquiry can still be rigorous. Acknowledging your normative starting points is more honest than pretending to view from nowhere. Storm proposes that scholars should be explicit about their emancipatory or ethical aims in research. This does not mean distorting findings to fit political agendas, which would be dishonest and counterproductive. It means acknowledging that the choice to study inequality, suffering, or injustice reflects value commitments. Research can still be methodologically rigorous while being motivated by concern for human flourishing. The pretense of value neutrality is abandoned, but not the commitment to evidence and careful reasoning. Values motivate inquiry, while evidence and argument constrain the conclusions we can legitimately draw. Vermeulen and van den Acker approach epistemology differently through their concept of informed naivety. This paradoxical phrase captures a stance toward knowledge that combines awareness with committed engagement. You know that your beliefs are constructed, partial, and potentially mistaken in ways you cannot detect. Yet you hold them and act on them anyway because paralysis is not an acceptable alternative. This is not self-deception because you maintain awareness of the epistemic situation throughout continuously. It is more like proceeding with appropriate humility while still making claims and taking positions. The Kantian as-if structure underlies much metamodern epistemology in both schools of thought. Kant argued we must act as if certain things were true, even without being able to prove them. We cannot prove that the world is orderly, but science must assume order to proceed. We cannot prove that humans are free, but ethics must assume freedom to assign responsibility. These are not articles of knowledge, but practical postulates necessary for rational activity to occur. Metamodernism extends this as-if structure to cultural and existential commitments more broadly. Acting as if meaning exists does not require metaphysical certainty that meaning is built into reality. Acting as if progress is possible does not require proof that history moves toward better futures. Acting as if communication can succeed does not require guaranteed access to another person's mind. The as-if stance enables committed action while remaining epistemically humble about ultimate foundations. You pursue horizons knowing they may recede forever because the pursuit itself generates value. This stance avoids both naive confidence and sophisticated paralysis that prevents moving forward at all. The question arises whether this epistemology is genuinely new or merely rediscovered pragmatism. American pragmatists like William James and John Dewey made similar moves over a century ago. They rejected both dogmatic foundationalism and nihilistic skepticism in favor of practical warranted assertability. Truth for pragmatists is what works, what helps us navigate and transform our experience successfully. Metamodernism inherits much from this tradition while responding to specifically postmodern challenges. The continuity with pragmatism is not a criticism, but rather situates metamodernism in a respectable lineage. One significant epistemological innovation is the emphasis on multiple modes of knowing beyond propositional knowledge. Western philosophy has privileged knowledge that can be stated in propositions as the paradigm case. But humans also know through practice, through participation, through bodily engagement with environments. This tacit or embodied knowledge resists full articulation, yet guides effective action in the world. Metamodernism often emphasizes recovering these other modes of knowing that modernity marginalized. Rationality is not abandoned, but expanded to include forms of intelligence beyond discursive reasoning alone. The relationship between individual and collective knowing also receives attention in metamodern epistemology. Knowledge is not simply held by individual minds, but distributed across communities, institutions, and artifacts. Scientific knowledge exists in journals, instruments, trained practitioners, and established practices collectively. This social dimension of knowledge was recognized before, but receives renewed emphasis in metamodern thought. How communities of inquiry are organized affects what knowledge can be produced and validated. Epistemology connects to social and political theory in ways that require interdisciplinary engagement. Part 4. Ontology. What exists and how. Ontology is the branch of philosophy concerned with what exists and what the nature of existence is. Modernism generally assumed a world of discrete objects with fixed properties existing independently of observers. Postmodernism challenged this picture by emphasizing how categories and objects are socially constructed. If gender, race, and disease are constructed rather than natural, perhaps all categories are similarly artificial. This constructivist insight created problems when pushed to extremes, denying any mind-independent reality. Metamodernism develops ontological positions that acknowledge construction while affirming that something exists to be constructed. Jason Josephson. Storm's process social ontology represents the most systematic metamodern contribution to ontology. He argues that the social world should be understood in terms of processes rather than substances. A substance in philosophical terminology is a thing that exists independently and has essential properties defining it. Aristotle's categories assumed substances as the basic furniture of reality, with accidents modifying them. Process ontology inverts this picture, making becoming more fundamental than being as a basic category. Things are not static entities, but patterns of activity temporarily stabilized into apparently persistent objects. This process turn draws on a philosophical tradition running from Heraclitus through Alfred North Whitehead. Heraclitus famously said, "You cannot step in the same river twice because it constantly changes." Less famously, his student reportedly said, "You cannot step in it even once," emphasizing radical flux. Whitehead developed process philosophy systematically in the 20th century as an alternative to substance metaphysics. He argued that actual occasions of experience are the basic units of reality, not enduring things. Storm draws on these traditions while applying them specifically to social and cultural phenomena. Social kinds are Storm's term for the categories through which we organize social reality. Religion, money, nations, genders and professions are all social kinds rather than natural kinds. Natural kinds, like gold or water, supposedly have essential properties that make them what they are. Social kinds lack such essences, but are no less real for being constructed through human practice. They exist as temporarily stabilized patterns maintained by various mechanisms of reinforcement and reproduction. Their reality is processual and historical rather than eternal and unchanging in character. Storm employs the concept of homeostatic property clusters borrowed from philosophy of biology. A natural kind, like a biological species, is not defined by essential properties all members share. Rather, members cluster together through various properties that tend to co-occur for causal reasons. Lions share many properties because of common ancestry and ecological niche, not because of lion essence. Social kinds work similarly, held together by institutional practices, shared beliefs, and material conditions. This framework allows real categories without requiring fixed essences that never vary across contexts. The implications for studying social phenomena are significant and practically important for research. Scholars need not define religion or art with necessary and sufficient conditions that capture all cases. Instead, they can trace the historical processes through which these categories emerged and stabilized. They can examine the mechanisms that maintain category boundaries and the forces that destabilize them. This approach combines the constructivist insight that categories are made with the realist insight that they are real. It enables empirical research without requiring impossible definitional precision about essentially contested concepts. Vermeulen and Van den Akker's ontology is less explicitly developed but implicit in their cultural analysis. They treat cultural sensibilities as real patterns that emerge from material and social conditions historically. Metamodernism is not merely in people's heads, but exists in artworks, buildings, and institutional practices. The structure of feeling has objective existence, even though it emerges from subjective experiences collectively. This is a modest realism about cultural phenomena compatible with acknowledging their historical contingency. Things could have been otherwise, but given how they developed, metamodernism is genuinely present in culture. The concept of emergence becomes important for understanding how social reality relates to physical reality. Emergent properties arise from complex systems but cannot be reduced to properties of their components. Consciousness emerges from neural activity but is not identical to any particular brain state simply. Similarly, social institutions emerge from individual actions but have causal powers individuals lack. Markets, languages, and legal systems do things that no individual participant could do alone. Metamodern ontology takes emergence seriously as a way to affirm social reality without substance dualism. The question of realism versus anti-realism about social kinds has significant political implications beyond academia. If race is a social construction, does that mean racism is somehow less real or harmful? If gender is constructed, does that invalidate the experiences of those who suffer gender-based oppression? Metamodernism answers no to both questions emphatically while maintaining the constructivist insight. Constructions are real, have real effects, and cause real suffering even without natural essences. Acknowledging construction does not diminish reality, but reveals how reality came to be this way. This ontological position enables a particular kind of critical analysis combined with constructive engagement. Understanding how categories were made reveals that they could potentially be remade differently. The contingency of social kinds is not cause for despair, but opportunity for transformation and reconstruction. Critique shows what exists need not have existed and might cease to exist through collective action. But construction requires building, not merely demolishing, which critique alone cannot accomplish adequately. Metamodern ontology supports both the critical and constructive moments of engaged intellectual work. Freinacht's developmental approach adds a temporal and hierarchical dimension to metamodern ontology. Social reality does not simply differ across contexts, but develops through stages of increasing complexity. Later stages build upon and transcend earlier stages rather than simply replacing them entirely. This developmental ontology is more controversial because it implies some arrangements are more advanced. The cultural aesthetic school avoids such hierarchical claims to maintain descriptive neutrality carefully. The developmental politics school embraces them as necessary for guiding social transformation toward better futures. The relationship between subjective experience and objective reality receives renewed attention in metamodern ontology. Postmodernism often seemed to collapse the objective into the subjective, making reality merely interpretation. Metamodernism insists that subjective experience is real and matters while not exhausting what exists. There is something it is like to be a conscious being, and this phenomenal reality deserves acknowledgement. But the world also constrains our interpretations, pushing back against constructions that badly misrepresent it. Neither pure objectivism nor pure subjectivism captures the complex relationship between minds and world. Some metamodern thinkers draw on what is called participatory ontology to articulate this relationship. Knowing is not passive reception of information from a separate world existing independently of knowers. It is active participation in a reality that is partly constituted through the knowing relationship itself. This does not mean we create reality arbitrarily through thought, which would be idealist fantasy. It means that the knower and known are entangled in ways that pure subject-object division misses. Reality is neither purely objective nor purely subjective, but emerges through participatory engagement continuously. Part 5. Historical Lineages. Part 1. Romanticism and German Idealism. Ideas do not appear from nowhere, but emerge from traditions that shape what becomes thinkable. Understanding metamodernism requires tracing the intellectual lineages that made it possible historically. Two movements from 18th and 19th century Europe are particularly relevant as background. Romanticism responded to Enlightenment rationalism with emphasis on emotion, imagination, and organic wholeness. German idealism developed philosophical systems attempting to overcome divisions between subject and object. Both movements grappled with tensions between finite human experience and infinite aspirations toward totality. Romanticism emerged in the late 18th century partly as reaction against mechanical worldviews. The Enlightenment had championed reason, science, and progress through systematic rational inquiry. Romantics felt this emphasis left out essential dimensions of human experience and meaning. Art, nature, emotion, and spiritual yearning seemed marginalized by purely rational approaches to life. The Romantic response was not rejection of reason, but insistence on its limits and supplements. Imagination and feeling provided access to truths that cold rationality alone could never reach. Friedrich Schlegel developed the concept of romantic irony that resonates strongly with metamodern sensibility. Romantic irony is not mockery or sarcasm, but recognition of the gap between aspiration and achievement. The artist strives for the infinite, but can only produce finite works that fall short inevitably. This recognition does not lead to despair, but to playful acknowledgement of necessary incompleteness. The work of art points beyond itself toward what it cannot fully capture or express. This structure of reaching toward unreachable horizons reappears centrally in metamodern theory. Schlegel wrote that romantic poetry is always becoming and can never be completed or perfected. It is the only kind of poetry that is more than a kind, being poetry itself, essentially. This processual understanding of art anticipates the emphasis on becoming over being in metamodernism. The romantic project was infinite striving without expectation of final arrival at destination. The journey itself constituted meaning rather than any terminus that would complete the quest. Metamodernism inherits this structure while adding awareness that such striving can become naive or dangerous. The concept of the sublime connected romantic aesthetics to experiences of overwhelming magnitude and power. Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant both theorized the sublime as distinct from the beautiful. The beautiful pleases through harmony, proportion, and form that we can comprehend comfortably. The sublime overwhelms our capacity to comprehend, producing a mix of terror and exaltation. Confronting vast mountains, storms, or the starry sky, we feel our smallness and something greater. This experience of finite beings, touched by intimations of infinity, recurs in metamodern aesthetics today. German idealism developed from Kant's critical philosophy, which had limited what reason could know. Kant argued we cannot know things in themselves, but only appearances structured by our minds. The categories of space, time and causality are not features of reality, but forms of experience. This created a gap between the phenomenal world we know and the noumenal world beyond access. Post-Kantian idealists like Fichte, Schelling and Hegel attempted to overcome this troubling division. Their systems tried to show how subject and object, mind and world could be unified ultimately. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel developed the most influential systematic response to Kantian limitations. His dialectical method traced how consciousness develops through contradictions toward absolute knowing. Each stage of development contains internal tensions that drive movement to higher stages. The famous pattern of thesis, antithesis and synthesis captures this dynamic, though Hegel rarely used those terms. History itself was the unfolding of spirit or Geist coming to know itself through human activity. This grand narrative of progress towards self-knowledge became the paradigm case of modernist meta-narrative. Postmodernism explicitly rejected Hegelian grand narratives as totalizing and potentially oppressive. Jean-François Lyotard defined postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives like Hegel's historical progress. Such narratives subordinate particularity to universal schemes that marginalize whatever does not fit. The violence of forcing diverse experiences into predetermined developmental trajectories became suspect. Metamodernism inherits this suspicion while asking whether all overarching narratives are equally problematic. Perhaps some narratives can guide without totalizing, if held with appropriate tentativeness and humility. The concept of dialectic undergoes transformation in meta-modern appropriations of German idealist thought. Classical dialectic moves through contradiction towards synthesis that preserves and transcends opposing positions. Metamodern oscillation resists synthesis, maintaining productive tension without final resolution continuously. The opposites do not merge into higher unity, but remain in dynamic relationship-generating movement. This is dialectic without teleology, movement without predetermined destination or guaranteed progress. The Hegelian confidence in necessary progression toward rational ends is abandoned while retaining dialectical method. Friedrich Schelling developed aspects of German idealism that resonate particularly with metamodern concerns. His philosophy of nature rejected the strict dualism between mind and material world that Kant preserved. Nature was not dead mechanism, but living process with its own inherent purposiveness and creativity. Mind did not impose form on formless matter, but emerged from nature's own self-organizing tendencies. This naturalistic idealism anticipated later process philosophy and contemporary complexity theory. Metamodern thinkers who emphasize emergence and self-organization often echo Schellingian themes unconsciously. The Romantic concept of organic form contrasted sharply with mechanical models of organization. Machines are assembled from parts that exist independently and function through external arrangement. Organisms grow from within according to their own internal principles of development and organization. The parts of an organism exist only in relation to the whole and cannot be understood separately. Romantics applied this organic model to societies, cultures, languages and artworks as living wholes. Metamodernism inherits this preference for organic over mechanical metaphors in understanding complex systems. The dangers of Romantic thought also inform metamodern caution about its own neo-Romantic tendencies. Romantic nationalism led to exclusionary politics based on organic conceptions of national community. The emphasis on feeling and intuition could justify irrationalism and rejection of critical thinking. Charismatic leaders claimed to embody the spirit of the people beyond rational challenge or accountability. These tendencies contributed to catastrophic political movements in the 20th century demonstrably. Metamodernism attempts to recover Romantic insights while remaining vigilant about their potential distortions. Vermeulen and Van den Acker explicitly identify a neo-Romantic turn in contemporary art as metamodern signature. Artists seek to re-enchant the world without forgetting postmodern critiques of naive enchantment. They pursue the sublime, the infinite, the transcendent, while knowing these cannot be grasped directly. The pursuit itself becomes the point, rather than any arrival at final spiritual destination. This is Romanticism filtered through postmodern awareness, sincere about yearning while ironic about fulfillment. The oscillation between Romantic aspiration and postmodern skepticism defines the metamodern aesthetic precisely. Part 6. Historical Lineages. Part 2. Pragmatism, Wittgenstein, and Process Philosophy. American pragmatism developed in the late 19th century as a distinctively practical approach to philosophy. Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey were its founding figures and primary developers. They rejected the pursuit of certainty that had dominated Western philosophy since Descartes sought foundations. Instead, they asked what difference ideas make in practice when acted upon in real situations. Truth was not correspondence to eternal reality, but what works in guiding successful action. This practical orientation resonates strongly with metamodern emphasis on engaged commitment over detached speculation. William James developed pragmatism as a method for settling metaphysical disputes that seem interminable. When philosophers disagree about whether the world is one or many, free or determined, ask what difference it makes. If no practical consequences follow from choosing one view over another, the dispute is meaningless. This test cut through much traditional metaphysics that James considered merely verbal dispute without substance. Metamodernism inherits this impatience with purely academic questions, disconnected from lived experience. Philosophy should help us live better, not merely produce clever arguments for professional advancement. James also developed the concept of the will to believe that anticipates metamodern as if thinking. In some situations, we must choose to believe before sufficient evidence is available to decide rationally. The choice itself can make the belief true by enabling actions that would otherwise be impossible. Believing you can jump a chasm may give you the confidence needed to actually succeed in jumping. This is not wishful thinking, but recognition that belief and action are intertwined in complex ways. Metamodern informed naivety similarly commits to positions that pure evidence cannot fully justify in advance. John Dewey extended pragmatism into education, politics, and social theory throughout his long career. He rejected the spectator theory of knowledge, where minds passively receive information from external reality. Knowing is active inquiry, problem-solving in situations where habits have broken down. We do not first know and then act, but rather know through acting and reflecting on consequences. This emphasis on embodied, situated practical intelligence anticipates metamodern critiques of disembodied rationalism. Dewey's democratic experimentalism also resonates with metamodern political theory seeking participatory governance. Richard Rorty revived pragmatism in the late 20th century while connecting it to continental philosophy. His work drew parallels between Dewey, Wittgenstein, and Heidegger as critics of traditional epistemology. Rorty argued we should abandon the quest for foundations and instead embrace contingency fully. Our vocabularies are tools we made for purposes, not mirrors reflecting how things really are. Some metamodern thinkers follow Rorty's anti-foundationalism, while others seek more robust realism than he allowed. The debate continues about whether pragmatism slides too easily into the relativism metamodernism wants to escape. Ludwig Wittgenstein's later philosophy provides another crucial resource for metamodern thought development. His early work sought to show the logical structure of language mirroring the structure of reality. His later work rejected this picture entirely in favor of understanding meaning through use in practice. Language is not a system of labels corresponding to objects, but a form of life, a social practice. Meaning depends on context, on what we do with words in particular situations and communities. This insight undermines the naive realism about language that much traditional philosophy assumed uncritically. Wittgenstein introduced the concept of language games to emphasize the multiplicity of linguistic practices. Describing, commanding, questioning, joking, and praying are different games with different rules. There is no single essence of language, only family resemblances among diverse practices we call language. This concept of family resemblance without essence anticipates Storm's homeostatic property clusters. Categories cohere not through shared essences, but through overlapping similarities without common core. Metamodern rejection of essentialism finds support in this Wittgensteinian framework about categorization. The concept of forms of life situates language games in broader patterns of human activity and meaning. A form of life is the taken-for-granted background against which particular activities make sense. You cannot explain why we play chess by listing rules, because following rules itself requires a form of life. At some point, explanations end, and we simply act, grounded in shared practices beyond justification. This insight connects to metamodern recognition that not everything can be made explicit or argued for. Some commitments are lived rather than demonstrated, shown rather than said in propositional form. David Foster Wallace studied philosophy and was deeply influenced by Wittgenstein's later work. His fiction often explores how language fails to capture experience while being all we have. The characters struggle with solipsism, wondering if genuine communication with others is possible at all. Wallace's solution was not abandoning language, but using it with care, attention, and sincere effort. This Wittgensteinian humility about what language can do while still doing important things with language informs his approach. The new sincerity Wallace advocated drew on this philosophical background about limits and possibilities of expression. Process philosophy developed primarily through Alfred North Whitehead in the early 20th century. Whitehead was a mathematician and physicist before turning to metaphysics in his later career. He rejected the substance metaphysics that had dominated Western thought since Aristotle's categories. Reality is not made of enduring things with changing properties, but of events or actual occasions. Each actual occasion is a moment of experience that perishes as it comes to be. The apparently stable objects of everyday experience are societies of occasions with pattern continuity. Whitehead's process philosophy has profound implications for understanding time, causation, and experience. The present is not a knife edge between past and future, but has its own thickness. Each moment inherits from past occasions and anticipates future possibilities in its own constitution. Causation is not external force acting on passive matter, but internal relations between occasions. Experience is not an epiphenomenon arising mysteriously from matter, but fundamental to reality itself. These ideas anticipate metamodern concerns with emergence, complexity, and the reality of subjective experience. Storm explicitly draws on process philosophy in developing his process social ontology for metamodernism. Social kinds are not static entities, but ongoing processes temporarily stabilized into apparent things. This Whiteheadian framework allows him to affirm the reality of social categories without essentializing them. What exists is not substance with accidents, but patterns of activity with varying degrees of stability. The world is not a collection of objects, but a web of processes mutually constituting each other. This ontology supports both the constructivist insight that categories are made and the realist insight that they are real. Henri Bergson developed another version of process philosophy, emphasizing duration and creative evolution. He argued that clock time spatializes duration, missing the continuous flow of lived experience. Real time is not composed of discrete instants, but flows indivisibly as qualitative change and development. Creative evolution occurs through elan vital, a vital impulse driving life toward increasing complexity. Bergson's ideas influence many 20th century thinkers and anticipate certain meta-modern themes about creativity. His critique of mechanistic thinking and emphasis on novelty resonate with meta-modern process orientation. The pragmatist, Wittgensteinian, and process traditions share certain features that metamodernism inherits. All reject the quest for certain foundations as misguided or impossible to achieve ultimately. All emphasize practice, activity, and process over static substances and eternal essences fundamentally. All are suspicious of dichotomies that traditional philosophy took for granted without adequate examination. Mind and body, subject and object, fact and value appear as abstractions from more fundamental continuity. Metamodernism weaves these traditions together in responding to specifically postmodern challenges and opportunities. Part 7. The Meaning Crisis and Cognitive Science Connection. Contemporary culture faces what some call a meaning crisis, manifesting in rising rates of anxiety and depression. Traditional sources of meaning like religion, community, and shared narrative have weakened considerably. Individual freedom and material prosperity have increased, while sense of purpose has declined for many. This paradox suggests that meaning requires something beyond personal choice and economic security. Metamodernism engages this crisis by asking how meaning might be reconstructed without returning to dogma. Cognitive science provides resources for understanding what meaning is and how it functions psychologically. John Vervaeke, a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto, has extensively analysed the meaning crisis. His lecture series traces how Western civilization progressively lost frameworks that made life feel meaningful. The scientific revolution disenchanted nature, removing purpose and value from the physical world itself. The Protestant Reformation privatized faith, making religion individual preference rather than shared reality. The Enlightenment privileged propositional knowledge over other forms of knowing that connected people to world. Each development had benefits, but cumulatively created conditions where meaning became scarce and fragile. Vervaeke distinguishes 4 kinds of knowing that humans possess and need for flourishing. Propositional knowing is knowledge that something is the case, expressible in statements with truth values. Procedural knowing is knowledge how to do something, embodied in skills rather than explicit beliefs. Perspectival knowing is knowledge what it is like to be in a situation, the felt sense of engagement. Participatory knowing is knowledge of being transformed through relationship with what one is knowing. Modern culture privileges propositional knowing while neglecting the others that ground meaning experientially. Participatory knowing is particularly relevant to metamodernism and understanding how meaning functions. When you really know a friend, you are not merely storing propositions about their properties. You have been transformed through the relationship and participate in a shared reality together. This knowing involves reciprocity, where both knower and known are changed through the relationship. Such knowing cannot be reduced to information processing or propositional attitudes about objects known. It requires engagement, commitment, and allowing oneself to be affected by what one knows. The concept of relevance realization provides a cognitive scientific framework for understanding meaning. At every moment, agents face potentially infinite information, but must select what matters for current concerns. Relevance realization is the process by which minds automatically filter and organize information meaningfully. It cannot be done by explicit rules, because applying rules requires already knowing what is relevant. This process is fundamental to cognition, yet largely invisible to introspection and conscious awareness. When it functions well, we experience the world as meaningful without effort or explicit reflection. Meaning in this framework is not a thing possessed, but a process of ongoing relevance realization. A meaningful life is one where relevance realization is working well, connecting self to world appropriately. Mental health problems often involve breakdowns of relevance realization through anxiety, depression, or psychosis. Too much seems relevant in anxiety, while too little seems relevant in depression fundamentally. Psychosis involves radical misassignment of relevance-making connections that do not serve adaptive functioning. Understanding meaning as process rather than content shifts how we approach the meaning crisis therapeutically. Verweiker connects cognitive science to contemplative traditions that have long addressed meaning and wisdom. Practices like meditation, contemplation, and philosophical dialogue cultivate capacities for enhanced relevance realization. They train attention, reduce egocentric bias, and open awareness to aspects of reality normally filtered out. These practices are not merely cultural artifacts, but address real cognitive needs with real effects. The current interest in mindfulness reflects intuitive recognition that something important has been lost. Metamodernism can draw on contemplative wisdom while subjecting it to critical examination rather than naive acceptance. The concept of insight connects meaning, cognition, and transformation in ways relevant to metamodernism. Insight is not merely acquiring new information, but restructuring how one sees a situation fundamentally. The aha moment involves sudden recognition that previous framing was inadequate or misleading. Insight produces understanding, which is not just knowing facts, but grasping how they fit together. This transformative character of insight connects knowing and being in ways propositional models miss. You become different through insight, not merely better informed about external matters of fact. Embodied cognition research shows that thinking is not confined to brains, but involves whole bodies. We think with our hands when gesturing, with our posture when expressing attitudes, with our movement through space. Concepts are grounded in bodily experience, rather than being abstract symbols manipulated by disembodied minds. Understanding grasps metaphorically, because physical grasping is the bodily basis of the concept. This embodiment connects to metamodern concerns with recovering forms of knowing that modernism marginalized. Rational minds turn out to be thoroughly embedded in feeling, sensing, moving bodies in environments. The extended mind thesis proposes that cognition extends beyond skin and skull into environment and tools. A notebook can be part of your memory system if you use it reliably to store information. Language and culture are cognitive tools that enable thinking otherwise impossible for individual brains. This view challenges the individualism that treats minds as self-contained units processing internal representations. Social and material contexts partially constitute cognition rather than merely providing inputs to inner processing. Metamodern emphasis on collective knowing and distributed intelligence finds support in extended mind research. Predictive processing theories model minds as prediction machines that try to minimize surprise. The brain constantly generates predictions about incoming sensory signals based on prior experience and models. Perception involves comparing predictions with actual signals and updating models when predictions fail. Action involves changing the world to make it match predictions rather than passively receiving information. This active, constructive view of mind resonates with pragmatist and process philosophy insights. We are not spectators of reality, but participants actively constructing experience through engagement. These cognitive scientific developments support metamodern positions without determining them uniquely. They suggest meaning is real and important, not merely subjective preference to be dismissed by hard science. They show that rationality is broader than propositional reasoning, including bodily and practical intelligence. They reveal mind as embedded, extended, and inactive rather than isolated inside individual skulls. Metamodernism can draw on these findings while remaining open to revision as science develops further. The dialogue between humanities and cognitive science is itself a metamodern move beyond disciplinary isolation. Part 8. Metamodernism and Affect: The Return of Feeling. Postmodernism was often criticized for being cold, ironic, and detached from genuine emotional engagement. The emphasis on surfaces, simulations, and linguistic play seemed to evacuate depth and authentic feeling. Characters in postmodern fiction were often flat, ironic observers rather than beings who suffer and yearn. This affective thinness was not merely aesthetic preference, but connected to epistemological commitments deeply. If authenticity is impossible and depth is illusion, why would art attempt to move us emotionally? Metamodernism marks a return to affect, feeling, and depth while not abandoning postmodern insights entirely. The concept of affect has become increasingly important in contemporary cultural and social theory. Affect refers to bodily intensities, feelings, and emotional states that move us before conscious cognition. It operates below or alongside propositional thought, influencing what we notice, desire, and avoid. The affective turn in theory recognizes that rationality never operates alone, but is always shaped by feeling. Metamodernism participates in this turn while connecting it to questions of meaning and engagement. Art that moves us, that generates feeling, does something that pure information transfer cannot accomplish. Vermeulen and van den Akker identify the return of affect as one of three signature themes in metamodernism. Alongside historicity and depth, affect marks the shift from postmodern flatness to metamodern engagement. Metamodern artworks seek to generate genuine emotional responses rather than merely clever recognition of references. The viewer or reader should feel something, be moved, not just appreciate the sophistication of construction. This does not mean abandoning formal innovation, but putting it in service of affective impact. The technical and the emotional are not opposed, but work together in metamodern aesthetic practice. The concept of sincerity becomes central to understanding metamodern affect and distinguishing it from manipulation. Sincerity in this context means genuine correspondence between expressed feeling and actual inner state. The sincere artist is not performing emotions for effect, but expressing something actually felt internally. This seems naive, given postmodern demonstrations that inner states are themselves constructed and performed. Metamodernism acknowledges this, while insisting that some expressions are nevertheless more sincere than others. The distinction matters even if it cannot be grounded in direct access to authentic, unmediated inner experience. The oscillation between sincerity and irony that defines metamodernism operates specifically in the affective register. You can express genuine feeling while being aware that feeling is historically conditioned and culturally shaped. You can be moved by a sunset while knowing that sunsets have been aestheticized by centuries of landscape painting. The ironic awareness does not cancel the sincere feeling, but frames it without negating its reality. Both layers remain present, creating a richer, more complex affective experience than either alone provides. This layering is what makes metamodern affect different from naive sentiment or cynical detachment equally. The concept of depthiness captures a particular metamodern relationship to depth that differs from modernist depth. Modernism believed in deep truth beneath surface appearances accessible through proper interpretation or analysis. Postmodernism argued there is no depth, only surfaces referring to other surfaces without ground. Depthiness is the performance of depth, the experience of depth, without commitment to actual hidden foundations. It generates the feeling of profundity without metaphysical claims about what really underlies appearances. This might seem like cheating, but it recognizes that depth is itself an experience, not just a claim. David Foster. Wallace's work exemplifies metamodern affect in its attempt to make readers genuinely feel. His fiction is technically sophisticated, formally innovative, and deeply engaged with literary tradition. But the ultimate purpose is not demonstrating cleverness, but creating connection between reader and text. He wanted fiction that made you feel less alone by recognizing shared human struggles and suffering. The extensive footnotes and self-conscious techniques are not ends in themselves, but means to this end. They earn the right to sincerity by showing awareness of how easily sincerity can become manipulative. The return of affect connects to broader cultural concerns about emotional well-being and mental health. Rates of depression, anxiety and loneliness have increased dramatically in wealthy developed societies. Something seems missing that material prosperity and individual freedom do not automatically provide. Metamodern affect addresses this lack by insisting that feeling matters and deserves artistic engagement. Art that moves us, connects us, and validates our emotional lives serves therapeutic as well as aesthetic functions. This is not art as therapy in a clinical sense, but art as part of what makes life bearable. The concept of attunement from phenomenology helps clarify how affect works in metamodern aesthetics. Attunement is the mood or atmosphere that colours all experience before any particular objects are noticed. When you wake anxious, everything appears threatening before you identify any specific danger. Attunement is not about any particular thing, but about how things in general show up and matter. Metamodern art works with attunement, creating atmospheres that dispose us toward particular ways of experiencing. The affect is not just in the artwork, but in the relationship between artwork and attuned perceiver. Nostalgia is a particularly complex effect that metamodernism handles with characteristic oscillation and nuance. Postmodernism treated nostalgia with suspicion as reactionary longing for a past that never existed. Nostalgia could legitimate conservative politics by idealizing golden ages before present decadence and decline. Metamodernism acknowledges these dangers while recognizing that nostalgia is a real and powerful feeling. It explores nostalgia without fully endorsing what is longed for or naively believing the past was better. The feeling is honored, while the beliefs it might generate are held critically and examined carefully. Hope is another affect central to metamodern sensibility that distinguishes it from postmodern cynicism. Postmodernism was suspicious of hope as potentially complicit with grand narratives that justify present suffering. Hope for future redemption could make people tolerate injustice instead of fighting against it now. Metamodernism insists hope is necessary for action even when its object remains uncertain or unreachable. You cannot work toward better futures without some hope that they are possible to achieve. This hope is not optimism, which expects good outcomes, but commitment to possibility despite uncertainty. The relationship between individual and collective affect receives attention in metamodern theory. Postmodernism emphasized how personal feelings are shaped by social and political forces beyond individual control. Your depression might reflect structural conditions rather than personal failure or brain chemistry alone. Metamodernism accepts this while asking how collective affect can be intentionally cultivated and transformed. If we made the conditions that produce alienation, we can potentially make conditions that foster connection. This moves from diagnosis to intervention, from critique to construction in the affective register. Part 9. Developmental Psychology and Stage Theory. Human beings develop over their lifespans, passing through stages of increasing capability and complexity. Infants cannot do what children cannot do what adolescents can, and development continues further. This obvious observation has been systematized in developmental psychology into stage theories of growth. The most famous is Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development, identifying stages in how children think. Later, researchers extended stage models into adulthood, suggesting development need not stop at adolescence. Metamodernism, particularly in its developmental politics form, draws heavily on these psychological frameworks. Piaget identified 4 major stages of cognitive development from infancy through adolescence. The sensorimotor stage involves learning through physical interaction before symbolic representation develops. The preoperational stage involves symbols and language, but lacks logical operations like conservation. The concrete operational stage enables logical thinking about concrete objects, but not abstract hypotheticals. The formal operational stage enables abstract reasoning, hypothetical thinking, and systematic problem-solving. Each stage builds on previous ones and cannot be skipped in the developmental sequence observed. Lawrence Kohlberg extended developmental thinking to moral reasoning rather than cognition alone. He identified stages from pre-conventional morality based on punishment and reward through conventional morality based on social norms. Post-conventional morality involves principled reasoning about justice that can critique existing social arrangements. Each stage represents more sophisticated capacity to consider multiple perspectives and universal principles. Moral development for Kohlberg paralleled cognitive development, with higher stages being genuinely better. This hierarchical claim generated controversy, but influenced much subsequent thinking about human development. Robert Kegan developed a particularly influential model of adult development relevant to metamodern thought. His theory traces how humans construct meaning through increasingly complex ways of organizing experience. At each stage, what was subject, the lens through which we see, becomes object, something we can see. This subject-object shift enables greater reflexivity and freedom from identifications that previously controlled us. Early stages are embedded in impulses, then needs, then relationships, then ideologies, then something further. The later stages enable holding multiple frameworks simultaneously without being captured by any single one. Kegan's Stage 4 involves a self-authoring mind that has its own ideology, values, and identity. Such individuals can evaluate external expectations against internal standards and choose accordingly. This is the capacity that modern society expects of adults: independent judgment and personal responsibility. But Kegan identifies a Stage 5, the self-transforming mind, that holds even self-authored identity loosely. At this stage, your own framework becomes object rather than subject, visible rather than invisible. You can modify your own meaning-making system rather than being limited to operating within it. Michael Commons developed the model of hierarchical complexity as a more rigorous framework for stages. This model defines stages mathematically by the complexity of tasks a person can successfully perform. Higher stages require coordinating elements from the previous stage into new, more complex organizations. The model has been applied to cognitive tasks, yielding empirical measures of developmental level. Freinacht draws heavily on this model to give precision to claims about developmental stages. The mathematical basis distinguishes this approach from looser stage theories based on clinical observation alone. The developmental approach makes claims about hierarchy that create controversy and require careful handling. To say later stages are higher is to imply they are in some sense better than earlier ones. This seems to violate postmodern commitments to equality and suspicion of hierarchical rankings. Is saying adults reason better than children an objectionable claim that marginalizes childhood experience? Most would agree there is something children cannot yet do that adults can do legitimately. The question is whether similar claims about adult stages involve inappropriate value judgments. Developmental thinkers respond that stages are hierarchically related in specific limited respects. Higher stages can do everything lower stages can do, plus additional operations not yet available. This is functional hierarchy about capacity, not value hierarchy about worth as human beings. A later stage adult is not more valuable than an earlier stage adult, just differently capable. And earlier stages have their own integrity, not being mere preparation for what comes later necessarily. Development is not progress toward a final goal, but ongoing transformation without predetermined terminus. The relationship between individual development and cultural development raises important theoretical questions. Cultures can be characterized by the developmental levels they support and make available to members. Some social arrangements foster development, while others arrest it at particular stages collectively. This cultural dimension connects psychology to politics in developmental metamodern thinking directly. Creating conditions for human flourishing means creating conditions where development can unfold fully. Freinacht's political metamodernism is essentially about building societies that support deeper development for more people. Critics worry that developmental frameworks smuggle Western values into supposedly universal stage sequences. What looks like development might be acculturation into particular ways of thinking valued by researchers. Kohlberg's highest stages resembled liberal philosophy, perhaps reflecting his own cultural background rather than universal truths. Cross-cultural research has raised questions about whether stages appear the same in non-Western contexts. Metamodernism must engage this critique seriously rather than assuming developmental claims are culturally neutral. The goal is frameworks that genuinely capture something about human potential without cultural imperialism. The concept of vertical development refers to movement between stages of increasing complexity or capacity. This contrasts with horizontal development, which is growth within a stage, adding skills and knowledge. Education mostly focuses on horizontal development, adding content at whatever stage students currently occupy. Vertical development requires more challenging interventions that destabilize current meaning-making structures. Optimal challenge, slightly beyond current capacity, promotes development without overwhelming completely. Creating conditions for vertical development is a key aim of developmental metamodern politics and education. The relationship between cognitive complexity and wisdom or virtue remains contested and unclear. Someone at a high developmental stage might use that capacity for destructive rather than beneficial purposes. Intelligence can serve evil as readily as good, and complexity does not guarantee ethical orientation. Freinacht acknowledges this, distinguishing cognitive development from state and depth dimensions that involve different capacities. A complete account of human flourishing requires attending to multiple dimensions, not reducing to stages alone. Developmental metamodernism at its best integrates cognitive, affective, and ethical dimensions of growth. Stage theories interact with metamodern oscillation in complex ways that require careful articulation. If metamodernism is a developmental stage, then oscillation between modern and postmodern would be its characteristic. Someone at the metamodern stage would have internalized both modern and postmodern capacities thoroughly. They could deploy either as appropriate rather than being stuck in one mode of operation. This is Keegan's self-transforming mind applied to cultural sensibility rather than individual meaning-making. The oscillation is possible because both poles have been made object and can be used consciously. Part 10. Political Applications, the Listening Society and Beyond. Politics concerns how communities organize collective life, distribute resources, and make binding decisions together. Modern politics developed institutions like representative democracy, constitutional rights, and market economies. These institutions represented enormous progress over feudal, monarchical, and authoritarian arrangements that preceded them. But they now face challenges that their original designers could not have anticipated or addressed. Climate change, technological disruption, and meaning crisis exceed the problem-solving capacity of existing frameworks. Metamodern political thought asks what new institutions and practices might address these unprecedented challenges. Hansi Freinacht's political metamodernism centers on the concept of the listening society as next evolutionary step. Modern welfare states address material needs through healthcare, education, pensions, and unemployment insurance. These provisions assume that meeting material needs is sufficient for human flourishing and social stability. But wealthy societies with excellent welfare states still experience epidemics of depression, anxiety, and loneliness. Something beyond material security is needed that current political frameworks do not adequately provide. The listening society would address psychological and developmental needs alongside material ones systematically. The term listening society refers to social arrangements where every person is genuinely seen and heard. This goes beyond formal rights to speak toward actual capacities to be understood and responded to. Many people feel invisible, their struggles unacknowledged, their perspectives excluded from public consideration entirely. This invisibility generates resentment, alienation, and susceptibility to demagogues who promise recognition and belonging. A listening society would create multiple channels for people to express themselves and be taken seriously. The political implications involve not just policies, but fundamental redesign of how institutions relate to citizens. Freinacht identifies 6 new forms of politics that a metamodern society would need to develop. Democratization politics would deepen and extend democratic participation beyond periodic voting for representatives. Gemeinschaft politics would foster genuine community bonds that modern individualism has weakened considerably. Existential politics would address questions of meaning, purpose, and mortality that current politics ignores. Emancipation politics would continue liberation from oppression while avoiding new forms of domination. Empirical politics would base policy on evidence while acknowledging the limits of technocratic expertise. Theory politics would cultivate shared understanding of complex challenges facing global civilization today. The concept of co-development captures how metamodern politics relates to human developmental potential. Rather than competing against each other in zero-sum games, individuals and groups would support mutual development. Your growth does not threaten me, but potentially contributes to conditions that support my growth also. This requires shifting from adversarial to collaborative orientations in political and economic relationships fundamentally. Competition has its place, but should be nested within larger cooperative frameworks that benefit all parties. The goal is arrangements where individual and collective flourishing reinforce rather than undermine each other. Nordic countries feature prominently in Freinacht's analysis as societies closest to metamodern political ideals. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland and Iceland combine market economies with extensive welfare states successfully. They score high on measures of happiness, trust, equality and social cohesion compared to other nations. Their political cultures emphasize consensus, pragmatism and willingness to experiment with new approaches. Freinacht sees them as fertile ground where metamodern political innovations might first take root. The Nordic ideology represents existing approximation of metamodern principles already operating in practice. Critics question whether Nordic success translates to larger, more diverse and differently situated societies. These are small, relatively homogeneous countries with particular historical trajectories and cultural traditions. What works in Denmark might not work in India, Brazil or the United States for various reasons. The metamodern response acknowledges context dependence while seeking generalizable principles beneath surface variations. Every society must find its own path, but some directions of travel are better than others universally. The Nordic example inspires without providing a blueprint that can be mechanically applied elsewhere directly. The relationship between metamodern politics and existing political ideologies requires careful navigation and thought. Metamodernism is neither left nor right in conventional terms, but draws on insights from multiple traditions. From the left, it takes concern for equality, solidarity, and critique of domination and exploitation. From the right, it takes appreciation for tradition, community, and limits of social engineering projects. From liberalism, it takes commitment to individual freedom, rights, and tolerance of diverse ways of living. The oscillation characteristic of metamodernism applies to political positions as well as cultural attitudes. This creates tensions with partisans who want clear ideological commitment to their side in political battles. If metamodernism refuses to be left or right, does it avoid taking stands when stands are needed? The response is that metamodernism takes stands on particular issues based on analysis rather than tribal loyalty. Sometimes leftist positions are correct, sometimes rightist positions, depending on context and evidence available. The refusal is not to take positions, but to adopt permanent ideological identity that predetermines all positions. This meta-ideological stance frustrates those seeking reliable allies, but enables more adaptive political judgment. Green politics and ecological concern are central to metamodern political thinking for obvious reasons. Climate change represents an existential threat requiring coordinated global action that current politics cannot deliver. The failure is not merely technical but reflects deeper problems with how modern societies make decisions. Short-term thinking, nationalist fragmentation, and capture by fossil fuel interests block necessary action persistently. Metamodern politics must address these structural obstacles to enable adequate response to ecological crisis. This requires both institutional innovation and cultural transformation in how humans relate to natural world. The concept of governance complexity emerges from recognizing that simple solutions cannot address complex problems. Modern governance developed for industrial society faces challenges that exceed its processing capacity fundamentally. The number of relevant variables, interdependencies, and feedback loops overwhelms traditional policy-making approaches. Metamodern governance would need to be as complex as the problems it addresses without becoming unmanageable. This requires new forms of distributed intelligence, participatory processes, and adaptive learning systems. Governance becomes ongoing experimentation rather than implementation of predetermined plans from above. Digital technology offers both opportunities and dangers for metamodern political development and practice. Social media promised democratization of voice, but delivered polarization, manipulation, and attention exploitation. Artificial intelligence could enhance collective decision-making or concentrate power in dangerous ways. The technology itself is not determinative. Outcomes depend on how societies choose to deploy it. Metamodern politics must grapple with technological governance to shape development toward beneficial ends. This requires technical understanding combined with ethical reflection that current political actors often lack. The question of scale presents particular challenges for metamodern political thinking and implementation. Local communities can practice listening and mutual development more easily than nations or global institutions. But many problems, like climate change, pandemics, and financial crises, operate at scales beyond local control. Metamodern politics must operate across scales, coordinating local, national, and global levels appropriately. The principle of subsidiarity suggests handling matters at the lowest level capable of addressing them effectively. Higher levels provide frameworks and resources, while lower levels retain autonomy for context-specific adaptation. Utopian thinking has been unfashionable since postmodernism criticized grand schemes for their totalitarian potential. But without some vision of better futures, politics becomes mere management of existing arrangements indefinitely. Metamodernism rehabilitates utopian imagination while acknowledging the dangers that postmodernism identified correctly. Utopias become directions of travel rather than final destinations that must be reached at all costs. The pursuit of unreachable ideals generates movement without requiring belief that perfection is achievable. This is informed naivety applied to political hope, commitment without fanaticism, aspiration without absolutism. Part 11. Metamodernism in Art and Culture. Metamodernism first emerged as a framework for understanding contemporary art before expanding into other domains. The original observations by Vermeulen and van den Akker concerned shifts in aesthetic practice and sensibility. Artists were doing something that did not fit comfortably into modernist or postmodernist categories anymore. They combined techniques and attitudes from both while generating effects that neither alone could produce. Understanding these artworks requires the oscillation concept that metamodernism developed theoretically to describe them. Examining specific examples reveals how the abstract framework operates in concrete cultural production. Wes Anderson's films exemplify metamodern aesthetics through their distinctive combination of style and feeling. His visual style is highly artificial, with symmetrical compositions, saturated colors, and dollhouse-like sets. This artificiality foregrounds the constructed nature of the cinematic world in typically postmodern fashion. Yet the emotional content is sincere, dealing with family trauma, loss, longing, and connection genuinely. Characters suffer real pain, even within obviously artificial environments that constantly remind us we watch fiction. The oscillation between artificial form and sincere content creates a distinctly metamodern emotional experience. The Royal Tenenbaums presents a dysfunctional family of former child prodigies dealing with failure and estrangement. The production design is obsessively detailed, creating a world that never existed outside the film. Yet the father's attempt at reconciliation, the suicide attempt, the gradual healing all feel emotionally real. Anderson does not mock his characters or hold them at ironic distance despite the stylized presentation. He loves them and wants us to love them, even when they behave badly and hurt each other. The artificial frame somehow makes the sincere emotions more rather than less affecting for viewers. Spike Jonze creates films that similarly oscillate between fantastic premises and genuine emotional exploration. Her features a man falling in love with an artificial intelligence operating system named Samantha. The premise is science fiction, potentially inviting satirical treatment of technology and human loneliness together. Instead, Jonze treats the relationship seriously, exploring what love means when the beloved is incorporeal. The heartbreak when Samantha evolves beyond human connection is played straight, not for ironic laughs. The film uses speculative fiction to access real questions about intimacy, dependence, and letting go sincerely. Michel Gondry's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind combines inventive visual technique with devastating emotional content. The story involves erasing memories of a failed relationship through a fictional medical procedure. Gondry employs creative practical effects to visualize memory fragmentation and dissolution on screen compellingly. The technique is playful, imaginative, demonstrating obvious cinematic artifice and inventive construction. But the exploration of how we hold on to painful memories because they contain love is utterly sincere. The ending affirms relationship despite knowing it will fail, hope despite awareness of inevitable pain. Television has produced some of the most discussed examples of metamodern sensibility in recent decades. BoJack Horseman features a washed-up sitcom star who is also literally a horse in anthropomorphic world. The absurd premise and animal-human hybrid characters establish ironic distance from the start immediately. Yet the show explores depression, addiction, trauma, and self-destruction with unflinching seriousness throughout. BoJack's pain is real pain. His failures have real consequences for himself and others around him. The cartoon format allows exploration of darkness that might be unbearable in live-action realism. Parks and Recreation exemplifies meta-modern optimism in its portrayal of local government and civic engagement. The show features a relentlessly optimistic protagonist, Leslie Knope, who believes in public service genuinely. Her sincerity is not undercut by irony. The show shares her faith that government can help people. This could be naive, but the show acknowledges obstacles, failures, and bureaucratic absurdity throughout. The humour comes from situations and characters, not from mocking the underlying commitment to community betterment. It demonstrates that sincerity can be funny without the humour negating or undermining the sincerity itself. David Foster Wallace's fiction represents a foundational text for understanding metamodern literature conceptually. Infinite Jest is a massive novel combining entertainment critique, addiction recovery, tennis academy life, and more. The formal techniques are sophisticated, including extensive footnotes, multiple timelines, and withheld information throughout. These techniques announce literary ambition and awareness of postmodern innovations in form explicitly. Yet the novel seeks genuine emotional connection with readers around themes of loneliness and recovery. Wallace wanted his virtuosity to serve communication, not to display cleverness for its own sake. Wallace's essay on television and fiction articulated the theoretical framework his fiction would embody practically. He diagnosed irony as a trap that had lost its critical power through co-optation by mainstream culture. The next rebels would risk sincerity, knowing they would be accused of sentimentality by sophisticated readers. His fiction takes this risk, pursuing genuine emotional effect through and despite formal complexity. The difficulty of his prose is not obstacle to feeling, but pathway through protective ironic defences. You must work to receive what he offers, and the work makes the reception more profound. Zadie Smith, Jonathan Franzen and Dave Eggers have been identified as metamodern novelists alongside Wallace. Each combines postmodern awareness with commitment to character, story and emotional engagement variously. Smith's White Teeth addresses multiculturalism, history and identity through richly developed characters in real situations. Franzen's The Corrections explores family dysfunction with both satirical edge and genuine compassion for suffering. Eggers, a heartbreaking work of staggering genius, uses metatextual techniques while processing real grief sincerely. These writers share metamodern oscillation while developing it through different styles and concerns individually. Architecture provided some of the earliest examples that Vermeulen and van den Akker analysed as metamodern. Herzog and de Meuron design buildings that combine modernist formal rigour with unexpected materials and effect. Their Beijing National Stadium, the Bird's Nest, uses chaotic steel structure expressing energy and movement. It is technically sophisticated and conceptually rigorous, while also generating visceral emotional response. The building works on multiple levels simultaneously, satisfying both intellectual analysis and immediate feeling. This integration of head and heart marks metamodern architecture against both cold modernism and playful postmodernism. Visual art has seen what Vermeulen and van den Akker call a neo-romantic turn toward affect and depth. Olafur Eliasson creates installations that generate sublime experiences of nature through technological means. His weather project placed an artificial sun in the Tate Modern's Turbine Hall, drawing millions of visitors. People lay on the floor, gazing at this fake sun, having genuine experiences of wonder and contemplation. The artificiality was obvious, yet did not prevent authentic emotional and even spiritual response from viewers. Eliason's work demonstrates that constructed experiences can generate real effects, not just ironic recognition. Ragnar Kjartansson creates durational performances that push sincerity to extreme lengths, testing viewer endurance. The Visitors features 9 musicians playing the same song repeatedly for over an hour on multiple screens. The repetition could become ironic commentary on itself, but instead builds genuine emotional intensity gradually. By the end, viewers often weep, moved by accumulation of sincere expression, sustained beyond normal limits. The extended duration burns through ironic defences that would protect against shorter emotional appeals effectively. Kjartansson's work earns sincerity through endurance, demonstrating commitment that cannot be dismissed as pose. Music has also exhibited metamodern tendencies through artists combining ironic awareness with emotional authenticity. Sufjan Stevens makes elaborately orchestrated albums exploring faith, loss, and American identity with evident sincerity. His song about his mother's death from cancer, 4th of July, is devastating without any protective irony. Yet his work also includes absurdist elements, costumes, and conceptual frameworks that prevent simple earnestness. The combination allows emotional access that pure sincerity or pure irony alone could not achieve. Listeners can feel deeply while knowing they engage with a self-aware artistic construction simultaneously. Part 12. Connections to other disciplines. Metamodernism developed primarily in cultural studies, philosophy, and political theory as academic disciplines. But its core concepts resonate with developments in other fields that arrived independently at similar insights. These resonances are not forced connections, but genuine parallels that illuminate metamodernism's broader significance. Complexity science, biology, economics, and ecology have all developed frameworks with metamodern characteristics. Tracing these connections reveals metamodernism as part of larger intellectual transformation across multiple domains. The pattern of moving beyond modern and postmodern assumptions appears repeatedly in diverse contexts. Complexity science studies systems whose behavior cannot be predicted from knowledge of their components alone. Simple rules governing individual elements can generate complex emergent patterns at the system level. Weather, ecosystems, economies, and brains all exhibit this kind of complexity that defies reductive analysis. Complexity science rejects both mechanistic determinism and mystical holism in favor of emergent middle ground. This resonates with metamodern rejection of both modern certainty and postmodern indeterminacy equally. Systems have real patterns that are neither fixed essences nor arbitrary constructions, but emergent stabilities. The concept of self-organization describes how complex systems generate order without external direction. No one designs a termite mound, yet termite colonies produce elaborate structures through local interactions. Markets, languages, and ecosystems similarly self-organize without central planning or intentional design. This challenges both the modern faith in rational planning and postmodern emphasis on power-imposing order. Order can emerge from below through processes that are neither designed nor arbitrary in nature. Metamodern politics draws on this insight in thinking about governance beyond top-down and bottom-up dichotomies. Edge of chaos is a complexity concept describing where systems are most adaptive and creative. Too much order produces rigidity that cannot respond to changing conditions or novel challenges. Too much chaos produces randomness that cannot maintain patterns needed for functional organization. The edge of chaos between these extremes enables both stability and flexibility simultaneously. This resonates with metamodern oscillation that avoids both rigid structure and complete dissolution. The productive zone is not a fixed point, but a dynamic region requiring continuous adjustment. Evolutionary biology has moved beyond simple gene-centered models toward more complex understandings of development. Extended evolutionary synthesis incorporates niche construction, developmental plasticity, and cultural inheritance. Organisms are not passive vehicles for genes, but active constructors of their own selective environments. This challenges both genetic determinism and blank slate environmentalism with more interactive frameworks. The organism-environment relationship is reciprocal, with both sides influencing each other continuously. This resonates with metamodern participatory ontology, where knower and known mutually constitute each other. Developmental systems theory in biology emphasizes how organisms develop through gene-environment interaction processes. There is no clear separation between nature and nurture because development requires both operating together. The same genes produce different outcomes in different environments, and environments affect which genes express. This process view of development parallels Storm's process social ontology for understanding social kinds. What exists is not static substance, but dynamic process producing temporarily stable patterns over time. The biological and social are both processual, rejecting essentialist assumptions about fixed underlying natures. Ecological thinking has influenced metamodernism through concepts like interconnection, feedback, and systemic causation. Ecosystems consist of relationships rather than isolated entities acting on each other externally and independently. Everything connects to everything else, making simple cause and effect thinking inadequate for understanding. Human societies are embedded in ecological systems, not separate from nature as modern thinking assumed. This embeddedness has ethical implications for how we treat the natural world we depend upon. Metamodern ecological politics insists on recognizing these connections and acting accordingly in policy. The Gaia hypothesis proposes Earth as a self-regulating system, maintaining conditions suitable for life. This is not mystical claim about planetary consciousness, but systems theory applied to biogeochemical cycles. Life does not merely adapt to conditions, but actively modifies conditions to sustain itself collectively. The hypothesis remains controversial, but has stimulated Earth system science as a legitimate field. It exemplifies thinking that transcends modern mechanism and postmodern skepticism toward systemic understanding. The Earth is neither dead matter nor conscious being, but complex, self-organizing system with emergent properties. Economics has seen challenges to neoclassical assumptions from behavioral, ecological, and complexity perspectives. Behavioral economics documents systematic deviations from rational actor models that standard theory assumed. People use heuristics, exhibit biases, and make decisions that optimization frameworks cannot explain or predict. This is not irrationality, but different kind of rationality adapted to real-world conditions of uncertainty. Ecological economics insists that economy is subsystem of environment, not separate sphere with independent logic. Complexity economics models markets as adaptive systems with emergent properties beyond individual rational choices. Kate Raworth's Donut Economics provides a framework resonant with metamodern political thinking. The donut has inner ring of social foundation, below which human needs go unmet, causing deprivation. It has outer ring of ecological ceiling, beyond which planetary boundaries are breached, causing environmental damage. The goal is the space between these rings where humanity can thrive without exceeding environmental limits. This image captures the metamodern sense of navigating between constraints rather than maximizing single variables. Good outcomes require balance and boundaries, not unlimited growth in any single direction, indefinitely. Network science studies how connection patterns affect system behavior across many different domains. Social networks, neural networks, and computer networks all exhibit properties that depend on their topology. Small world networks with high clustering and short path lengths appear repeatedly in natural and social systems. These structures enable both local cohesion and global integration, combining modularity with connectivity. Metamodern politics draws on network thinking in designing governance systems that balance local and global. The network model offers alternative to both hierarchical control and anarchic fragmentation in organization. Physics has seen interpretive debates about quantum mechanics that parallel metamodern epistemological themes. The measurement problem concerns how observation seems to affect what is observed at quantum scales. Different interpretations disagree about whether reality is determinate, whether observers play constitutive roles. Some interpretations involve participatory elements where observation and reality are entangled fundamentally. While physics and philosophy differ significantly, the theme of participation resonates across both domains. Neither pure objectivism nor pure subjectivism adequately captures the relationship between observer and observed. The concept of complementarity from quantum mechanics offers a model for holding apparent contradictions together. Niels Bohr proposed that wave and particle descriptions of light are complementary rather than contradictory. Neither description is complete alone, and both are needed to account for different experimental situations. This acceptance of irreducible plurality without seeking single unified description resonates with metamodern oscillation. Some domains may require multiple frameworks that cannot be synthesized into one comprehensive view ultimately. Living with complementary descriptions is not failure, but appropriate response to complex reality genuinely. Part 13. Competing and Related Frameworks. Metamodernism is not the only attempt to articulate what comes after postmodernism philosophically and culturally. Several competing frameworks have emerged, each with different emphases, methods, and intellectual genealogies. Understanding how metamodernism relates to these alternatives clarifies its distinctive contributions and limitations. Some frameworks overlap significantly, while others propose quite different diagnoses and prescriptions altogether. The proliferation of postmodern proposals itself indicates widespread sense that something has shifted recently. Which framework proves most useful may depend on what questions one asks and what problems one addresses. Integral theory, developed primarily by Ken Wilber, offers a comprehensive framework for integrating human knowledge. Wilber maps perspectives along two axes, interior-exterior and individual-collective, creating 4 quadrants. Each quadrant captures legitimate aspects of reality that reductionist approaches tend to collapse inappropriately. Development occurs through stages in each quadrant, with later stages being more complex and inclusive. Integral theory shares with metamodernism the concern for development and the rejection of postmodern flatness. Freinacht's developmental metamodernism draws explicitly on integral theory and neo-Piagetian stage models. The relationship between metamodernism and integral theory involves both convergence and tension simultaneously. Both are post-postmodern, both emphasize development, both seek to include rather than exclude perspectives. But integral theory is more systematic, claiming to map all possible perspectives in comprehensive framework. Metamodernism is more modest, describing a sensibility rather than claiming to integrate all knowledge completely. Vermeulen and van den Akker explicitly reject system building in favor of descriptive cultural analysis approach. Whether this modesty is virtue or limitation depends on what one thinks cultural theory should accomplish. Cosmodernism proposes a global, interconnected consciousness emerging from planetary awareness and digital connection. Christian Mararu developed this framework, emphasizing how globalization creates new forms of cultural identity. Identity is no longer bounded by nation, ethnicity, or locality, but formed through global networks and flows. Cosmodernism shares metamodernism's attention to contemporary cultural shifts, but emphasizes global dimension more. The prefix cosmo suggests planetary scale that metamodernism's cultural aesthetics focus does not necessarily foreground. Both frameworks describe emerging sensibilities without necessarily prescribing how culture should develop further. Altermodernism, proposed by curator Nicolas Bourriaud, emphasizes artists as nomads traversing cultural landscapes. The modern and postmodern debate is superseded by condition of permanent cultural translation and wandering. Artists do not belong to single traditions, but move between multiple traditions, combining elements freely. This nomadic condition reflects globalized art world, where locality no longer determines artistic identity primarily. Altermodernism shares with metamodernism the sense of moving beyond fixed positions toward dynamic navigation. But it lacks the oscillation concept and does not theorize the specific tension between sincerity and irony. Digimodernism, developed by Alan Kirby, focuses on how digital technology has transformed cultural production fundamentally. In digimodern culture, the audience participates in creating content rather than passively consuming finished works. Wikipedia, social media, and video games exemplify this participatory culture where users are also producers. Kirby argues this represents genuine cultural shift, not just continuation of postmodernism with new technology. Metamodernism and digimodernism describe different aspects of contemporary culture that may coexist rather than compete. One emphasizes affective and epistemic shifts, the other technological and participatory transformations occurring. Performatism, proposed by Raoul Eshelman, focuses on how contemporary works create unified aesthetic experiences. Against postmodern fragmentation, performatist works frame experience to produce moments of beauty and transcendence. The frame is visible. We know the experience is constructed, yet we participate in it sincerely anyway. This framing device enables belief after skepticism, similar to metamodern-informed naivety conceptually. Performatism and metamodernism converge in describing return to sincere engagement mediated by formal awareness. The terminology differs, but the phenomena being described overlap considerably in actual instances. New sincerity is sometimes treated as distinct movement, and sometimes as component of broader metamodernism. The term emphasizes the return of sincere expression against postmodern irony and cynical detachment. David Foster Wallace became the emblematic figure for new sincerity through his essays and fiction. Metamodernism incorporates new sincerity while adding the oscillation concept and broader cultural analysis framework. New sincerity can seem one-sided if it abandons irony entirely, which metamodernism insists it should not. The relationship is that sincerity returns but remains in dynamic tension with ironic awareness continuously. Postmodernism is an umbrella term covering various attempts to name what follows the postmodern period. It has the virtue of clarity about temporal positioning while lacking specific content about what characterizes present. Metamodernism, cosmodernism, digimodernism, and others all count as postmodernisms in this generic sense. The term is useful for indicating shared historical moment without committing to particular theoretical framework. Its vagueness is both strength, allowing inclusiveness, and weakness, providing little analytical purchase on phenomena. More specific terms are needed to actually analyze and understand contemporary cultural developments adequately. Posthumanism shares concerns with metamodernism about moving beyond modern assumptions regarding human nature. It challenges the centrality of the human subject that modern philosophy took for granted entirely. Humans are not separate from, but continuous with animals, machines, and environments in complex ways. This decentering of the human connects to ecological and technological themes in metamodern thought. But posthumanism can seem to extend postmodern deconstruction rather than reconstruct after deconstruction completes. Metamodernism seeks reconstruction alongside deconstruction, which may distinguish it from some posthumanist projects. Speculative realism emerged in philosophy, challenging the correlation between thought and being that Kant established. Thinkers like Quentin Meillassoux argue for access to reality independent of human thought and experience. Object-oriented ontology, associated with Graham Harman, treats objects as having their own reality beyond human use. These philosophical movements share metamodernism's dissatisfaction with linguistic constructivism's limitations. They seek to recover something like realism after the postmodern critique of naive correspondence theories. Storm's meta-realism engages similar terrain while maintaining more connection to pragmatist and process traditions. The proliferation of frameworks indicates genuine difficulty in naming and understanding contemporary cultural conditions. No single framework has achieved dominance or consensus about how to characterize the present moment adequately. This may reflect that we are in the middle of transitions whose shapes are not yet clear from inside. Different frameworks illuminate different aspects while potentially missing what others capture more effectively. Metamodernism's advantage may be its combination of cultural description, philosophical depth, and political application. Its limitation may be vagueness about what precisely oscillation means and how it operates mechanistically. Part 14. Major Critiques and Scholarly Debates. Any framework that gains attention attracts criticism that tests its coherence, validity, and usefulness. Metamodernism has received various critiques that deserve serious engagement rather than defensive dismissal. Examining these critiques reveals both genuine limitations and misunderstandings that clarification can address. A mature intellectual movement incorporates valid criticism rather than insulating itself from challenge dogmatically. The following critiques represent major concerns raised by scholars who have engaged metamodernism carefully. How metamodernism responds to these critiques will shape its development and reception going forward. The vagueness objection argues that metamodernism lacks clear definition and precise conceptual content. What exactly does oscillation mean, and how would we recognize it operating in specific cases? The term seems to apply to anything that mixes sincerity with irony, which may be too broad. If nearly all contemporary culture exhibits some metamodern features, the concept loses discriminating power. A concept that applies to everything applies to nothing and provides no analytical leverage. This critique demands greater specificity about what metamodernism is and is not in concrete terms. Defenders respond that structure of feeling inherently resists precise definition without thereby being meaningless. Raymond Williams introduced the concept precisely to capture emergent sensibilities before they crystallize fully. Demanding definition appropriate for natural kinds would misunderstand what cultural categories are and do. Metamodernism is more like a family resemblance concept than a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. This does not mean anything goes. Some works are clearly more metamodern than others recognizably. The vagueness critique may reflect inappropriate expectations about what cultural theory can provide legitimately. The novelty objection questions whether metamodernism identifies anything genuinely new in cultural history. Romantic irony in the 19th century combined sincerity with self-awareness in ways resembling metamodernism. The oscillation between hope and skepticism appears in many historical periods under different names previously. Perhaps what metamodernism describes is perennial human condition rather than specifically contemporary sensibility. If so, the claim to identify postmodern shift may be overstated or even mistaken entirely. The periodization that places metamodernism after postmodernism may be more rhetorical than substantive, actually. Defenders acknowledge historical precedents, while insisting current manifestation has distinctive features nonetheless. Romantic irony existed before modernism, but metamodernism responds specifically to postmodern critique and context. The oscillation now operates with awareness of postmodern insights that 19th century could not have. Historical recurrence does not negate historical specificity. Similar patterns can have different meanings in different contexts. The question is whether contemporary oscillation differs enough from predecessors to warrant new terminology. This empirical question requires careful comparison that neither simply asserts novelty nor denies it a priori. The coherence objection argues that oscillation between contradictory positions is not genuine philosophical stance. Either reality has objective features or it does not. You cannot meaningfully oscillate between these options. Pretending otherwise does not create new paradigm, but evades the implications of positions genuinely held. Metamodernism might be sophisticated fence-sitting that avoids commitment by perpetually moving between alternatives. Real intellectual positions require choosing and defending rather than endlessly repositioning between choices. The oscillation concept may disguise incoherence as depth, making a vice appear as virtue deceptively. Defenders respond that the critique assumes excluded middle logic that may not apply to all domains. Perhaps some questions do not admit of binary answers and require holding tensions without resolution. The pragmatist tradition suggests that some metaphysical disputes lack practical consequences and need not be resolved. Oscillation may be appropriate response to genuine complexity rather than evasion of clear-cut alternatives. The critique may project false dichotomies onto domains where more nuanced stances are warranted legitimately. Whether metamodern oscillation is coherent depends on whether the binaries it oscillates between are genuine disjunctions. The Western centrism objection argues that metamodernism describes phenomena specific to Western developed societies. The sequence from modernism through postmodernism to metamodernism reflects European and American intellectual history. Other cultures have different trajectories that may not fit this periodization scheme at all. Applying metamodernism globally risks cultural imperialism disguised as universal developmental framework. The claim that metamodernism represents advance may impose Western values on non-Western context inappropriately. Greater attention to non-Western cultural production and theory is needed to test universal claims seriously. This critique has significant force, and metamodernism has not adequately addressed it yet to date. Most examples cited are from North America, Western Europe, and cultural products consumed in these regions. Whether similar sensibilities are emerging globally or only in specific cultural contexts remains unclear empirically. Freinacht's focus on Nordic countries as model raises similar concerns about generalizing from particular cases. Metamodernism would benefit from serious engagement with non-Western cultural theory and artistic production. The response cannot be assuming Western frameworks apply universally without examining this assumption critically. The political objection argues that metamodernism's both-and stance enables avoidance of necessary political commitment. In situations requiring solidarity with oppressed groups, oscillation between positions may be inappropriate luxury. The metamodern rejection of fixed ideology can slide into centrist equivocation that maintains existing injustice. When asked whose side it is on, metamodernism's answer seems evasive or deliberately unclear politically. This suspicion intensifies given that most metamodern theorists occupy privileged positions in wealthy societies. The framework may reflect and serve class interests of those who can afford perpetual repositioning. Defenders argue that metamodernism takes political positions on particular issues while refusing fixed ideological identity. Opposition to climate destruction, support for democracy, and concern for human flourishing are genuine commitments. The refusal of left versus right framing reflects recognition that these categories may not serve contemporary challenges. Oscillation is not between oppressor and oppressed, but between different approaches to addressing injustice. The critique may conflate ideological flexibility with ethical relativism that metamodernism does not endorse. Taking context seriously in political judgment is not same as having no principles or commitments. The recuperation objection worries that metamodernism will be co-opted by capitalism as postmodernism was. Advertisers and corporations can easily adopt oscillation, sincerity, and authenticity as marketing strategies. The culture industry excels at packaging rebellion and selling it back to consumers as commodity product. If metamodernism becomes another aesthetic to be consumed, its critical potential dissipates entirely into marketplace. This has already happened with metamodern adjacent concepts like authenticity that pervade branding now. The framework may be doomed to absorption regardless of its originator's intentions and hopes. This critique reflects genuine historical pattern that any cultural movement must take seriously and address. The response cannot be guaranteed inoculation against co-optation, which is probably impossible anyway. But metamodernism at least provides resources for recognizing and critiquing commodified versions of itself reflexively. Ironic awareness of authenticity's marketability is part of the metamodern sensibility from the beginning. The ongoing oscillation potentially prevents settling into fixed forms that can be easily packaged. Whether this is sufficient protection against recuperation remains to be seen through ongoing cultural struggle. Part 15. Limitations, boundary cases, and failure modes. Every framework has limits beyond which it ceases to illuminate and may actively mislead understanding. Recognizing these limits is not criticism, but mature acknowledgement of what any particular approach can do. Metamodernism illuminates certain phenomena well, while being less useful or even problematic for others. Identifying boundary cases reveals where the framework strains and where alternatives might serve better. Failure modes show how metamodernism can go wrong when misapplied or pushed beyond appropriate domains. Honest assessment of limitations strengthens rather than weakens intellectual frameworks over time. Metamodernism works best for analyzing cultural production in relatively affluent, educated Western contexts. The examples that fit most clearly come from independent film, literary fiction, and contemporary art worlds. These are domains where cultural producers have resources and freedom to experiment with form and feeling. Mass culture, popular entertainment, and non-Western cultural production fit less neatly into the framework. The limitation is not that metamodernism is wrong, but that its scope may be narrower than claimed. Expansion beyond core cases requires careful attention to whether the concepts actually illuminate new domains. Metamodernism struggles with cultural production that does not exhibit oscillation between identifiable poles. Some contemporary work is straightforwardly sincere without ironic awareness or postmodern self-consciousness. Other work remains thoroughly ironic, without moments of genuine emotional engagement or sincere expression. Forcing such work into metamodern framework distorts what it is actually doing aesthetically and conceptually. The framework should acknowledge that not all contemporary culture is metamodern in any meaningful sense. Periodization does not mean everything in a period exhibits the dominant sensibility uniformly throughout. The developmental politics version of metamodernism risks authoritarianism through its hierarchical stage framework. If some people are at higher developmental stages, should they have more political power than others? Freinacht explicitly rejects this conclusion, but the framework creates pressure toward it logically. Historical precedents of rule by those claiming superior knowledge or development are not encouraging at all. The listening society could become justification for technocracy or meritocracy that excludes ordinary citizens. Metamodern politics must actively guard against these failure modes without abandoning developmental insights entirely. The emphasis on oscillation can become excuse for never committing, never taking definitive positions on anything. Perpetual movement between positions can be performance of sophistication that actually accomplishes nothing. At some point, problems require decisions that foreclose alternatives and commit to particular courses of action. Climate change, for instance, requires massive, sustained commitment to specific policies, not endless oscillation. Metamodernism as disposition may need supplementation by frameworks better suited to decisive action. The question is when oscillation serves understanding and when it becomes obstacle to necessary commitment. The as-if structure can slide into bad faith if the awareness of impossibility becomes excuse for half-heartedness. Pursuing goals you believe are unreachable might produce less effort than pursuing goals you believe achievable. The metamodern might unconsciously protect themselves from failure by never fully committing to success genuinely. This would be not informed naivety, but sophisticated cynicism disguised as philosophical sophistication actually. The difference between genuine as-if commitment and performative going through motions may be difficult to distinguish. Metamodernism must cultivate authentic commitment, not just its appearance or theoretical possibility abstractly. The return of affect can become sentimentality that avoids hard thinking in favor of feeling good. Emphasis on emotional engagement might be used to dismiss rigorous argument as cold or disconnected. This would represent regression from genuine intellectual achievement, not advance beyond postmodern limitations. Metamodernism, at its best, integrates affect and intellect rather than substituting one for the other. The failure mode is using sincerity as license to avoid the discipline that good thinking requires. Feeling deeply does not excuse thinking poorly. Both capacities deserve development and exercise. The critique of postmodern irony can become dismissal of irony's genuine and ongoing value as tool. Irony remains appropriate response to hypocrisy, pretension, and abuse of power in many contexts. The metamodern return to sincerity should not mean abandoning irony's critical capacity entirely. Some sincere expressions deserve ironic deflation because they mask self-interest or harmful ideology. The oscillation should preserve irony for appropriate targets while also enabling sincere engagement. Losing irony entirely would impoverish rather than enrich available responses to complex social reality. The framework may individualize what are actually structural and collective problems requiring political solutions. Focus on personal development, inner states, and individual meaning-making can distract from systemic change needed. The listening society might become therapy for individuals rather than transformation of social structures actually. Capitalism, racism, and patriarchy require collective action against structural forces, not just personal growth. Metamodernism must maintain connection between individual and structural levels without reducing either to other. The failure mode is using inner work as substitute for political organizing and collective struggle genuinely. The terminology itself may become obstacle as it proliferates and fragments into competing usages. When different authors mean different things by metamodernism, communication becomes difficult or impossible. The term may become so contested that it ceases to function as shared concept for productive discussion. This fate befell postmodernism, which became so variously defined that some abandoned the term entirely. Metamodernism may need either terminological discipline or acknowledgement that multiple metamodernisms exist legitimately. Clarifying which metamodernism one means becomes necessary for any substantive conversation to proceed. Finally, metamodernism may simply be transitional moment rather than stable new paradigm for cultural understanding. What we now see as metamodern may be passage between postmodernism and something else not yet nameable. The oscillation might resolve into new synthesis or dissipate into fragmentation without achieving stable form. Future scholars may view metamodernism as interesting early attempt to name shift whose nature became clear later. This uncertainty is not failure, but appropriate humility about making claims while inside the phenomena described. Metamodernism describes what we see now without guaranteeing this description will remain adequate forever. Part 16. The Metacrisis and Future Directions. Contemporary civilization faces interconnected crises that compound each other in ways that exceed any single framework. Climate change, biodiversity collapse, political polarization, technological disruption and meaning crisis interact systemically. Addressing one crisis in isolation often worsens others through unintended consequences and feedback loops. This situation has been called the metacrisis, to indicate its systemic character transcending particular problems. Metamodernism claims relevance to addressing this metacrisis through its distinctive capacities and orientations. Whether this claim proves warranted depends on whether metamodern approaches can mobilize effective responses. The ecological crisis represents existential threat that current social systems seem incapable of addressing adequately. We know what needs to happen: massive reduction in emissions, protection of ecosystems, transformation of production. Yet knowledge does not translate into action at anywhere near the scale and speed required urgently. This gap between knowing and doing reflects deeper failures than mere technical or political obstacles. Something about how modern societies think, feel and organize prevents adequate response to known dangers. Metamodernism's concern with meaning, affect and developmental capacity may address these deeper failures. Modern culture treats nature as resource for human use, external environment to be manipulated for our purposes. This instrumental relationship enabled unprecedented material prosperity through exploitation of natural systems. But it also generated the ecological destruction that now threatens the prosperity it produced initially. Metamodernism's participatory ontology suggests different relationship where humans are part of nature, not apart from it. This shift in basic orientation could support the cultural transformation that technical solutions require for implementation. Ecological crisis is partly crisis of worldview that sees nature as dead matter rather than living system. Political polarization has intensified in many democracies, making collective action increasingly difficult to achieve. Left and right inhabit different information environments with different facts, not just different interpretations. This fragmentation makes the coordination required for addressing complex challenges nearly impossible politically. Metamodernism's refusal of fixed ideological identity offers potential resource for bridging polarized positions. The oscillation between perspectives might enable dialogue across divides that partisanship makes insurmountable. Whether this potential can be realized depends on whether enough people adopt metamodern orientations practically. The meaning crisis contributes to political dysfunction through susceptibility to populist and authoritarian appeals. When people lack sense of purpose and belonging, demagogues offering identity and meaning find ready audiences. The empty irony of postmodern culture left populations vulnerable to those promising fullness and certainty seductively. Metamodernism's return to meaning and affect might inoculate against these appeals without returning to dogmatism. Informed naivety could satisfy the hunger for meaning while maintaining critical capacity against manipulation. This is not guaranteed outcome, but possibility that metamodern cultural production and politics might support. Technological development, particularly artificial intelligence, raises profound questions about human future and flourishing. AI systems now perform tasks that seemed exclusively human just years ago, with rapid acceleration continuing. The economic, political, and existential implications of advanced AI remain unclear but potentially enormous. Metamodernism's emphasis on human development, meaning, and participatory knowing becomes particularly relevant here. What makes human life valuable if machines can do everything humans can do, perhaps better and faster? The answer must lie in dimensions of experience and being that machines cannot replicate or replace. The concept of wisdom becomes increasingly important as knowledge alone proves insufficient for navigating complexity. We have more information than ever, but seem less able to use it wisely for human benefit. Wisdom involves knowing how to live well, not just knowing facts about the world theoretically. It requires integration of knowledge with feeling, values, and practical judgment in particular situations. Metamodernism's emphasis on multiple ways of knowing beyond the propositional supports the recovery of wisdom. The meaning crisis is partly wisdom crisis that metamodern education and culture might begin to address. The future of metamodernism as intellectual movement depends on whether it can attract serious, sustained engagement. Currently, it remains relatively marginal, known mainly in academic and online subcultures, not broader publics. For metamodernism to matter for the meta-crisis, it must somehow influence mainstream culture and institutions. This requires translation from theoretical discourse into forms accessible to people without specialized training. The challenge is maintaining intellectual depth while communicating with audiences beyond academic specialists. Popularization risks distortion, but isolation guarantees irrelevance to the problems that motivated the project. Institutionalization presents both opportunities and dangers for metamodernism's future development as framework. Academic programs, journals, and conferences could support sustained research and build scholarly community. But institutionalization also domesticates radical ideas into forms compatible with existing academic structures legitimately. Metamodernism emerged partly outside conventional academia. Whether it should now seek academic legitimacy is unclear. The developmental politics wing seems more oriented toward practice and political impact than academic recognition. Different wings may pursue different institutional strategies suited to their different aims and audiences. The question of what comes after metamodernism already arises even as metamodernism itself remains incompletely developed. If metamodernism is transitional, what is it transitioning toward that we cannot yet clearly see? Some speculate about post-metamodern possibilities while acknowledging we cannot know the future from inside present. Perhaps the next stage will resolve the oscillation into new synthesis, or move in entirely unexpected directions. Metamodernism, at minimum, opens question of what adequate cultural sensibility for our time would be. Whether it answers that question or merely poses it well, the posing itself has value for understanding. The ultimate test of any intellectual framework is whether it helps people live better and address real problems. Metamodernism will be judged by whether it enables responses to crises that other frameworks cannot provide. This pragmatic criterion does not reduce truth to usefulness, but acknowledges ideas exist to serve life. The ideas matter because the crises matter, and because current frameworks seem inadequate to those crises. Metamodernism offers itself as resource for thinking and acting in times that demand both thought and action. Whether it delivers on this offer remains to be determined through ongoing practice and engagement. The conversation about metamodernism continues, evolving through contributions from scholars, artists, and practitioners worldwide. New examples emerge, critiques are raised and addressed, and the framework develops through this ongoing dialogue. Those who encounter these ideas are invited not just to consume, but to participate in their development. Metamodernism is not finished doctrine to accept or reject, but living discourse to join and shape actively. The future depends on what those who take these ideas seriously do with them in their own work. Understanding metamodernism fully requires not just learning about it, but experimenting with its possibilities directly. We began by identifying the problem metamodernism claims to solve: paralysis after postmodern deconstruction of meaning. We traced its origins, core mechanisms, major schools, and connections to broader intellectual and cultural developments. We examined its philosophical commitments, historical lineages, and applications across multiple domains seriously. We engaged critiques honestly and acknowledged limitations without pretending the framework is perfect or complete. What remains is for each person encountering these ideas to determine what use, if any, they serve. The oscillation continues between understanding and action, between theory and practice, between thought and life.